On paper, it was supposed to be a coronation, a celebration. The night a new king would be crowned and a struggling company would finally turn the page on a decade of controversy. The camera showed a packed arena, a spinning tournament bracket, and a smiling man in a crown being handed a scepter that was meant to symbolize the future. But the cameras lied. Because what really happened that night in Dayton, Ohio, was not a coronation at all. It was a betrayal, a quiet, calculated act of backstage warfare between Hulk Hogan and Bret Hart that would poison the relationship between those two men for the next 30 years. It was the night the most famous man in wrestling, Hulk Hogan himself, had a fireball shot into his face by the 500-pound giant Yokozuna and then vanished from the company for nearly a decade. And it was the night a group of men, Mr. Perfect, Bam Bam Bigelow, Crush, and Bret's own brother, Owen Hart, celebrated a bright new future together, completely unaware that within a few short years, so many of them would be dead before they ever reached 50. In this video, we go behind the curtain of one of the most important and most tragic pay-per-views the company ever produced. We uncover the secret meeting that made a grown man cry backstage. We reveal the promise that was broken, the lie that owner Vince McMahon is accused of telling Hulk Hogan and Bret Hart at the same time, and how by their own accounts, he played the two of them against each other to protect his own bottom line. And this is the dark truth behind King of the Ring 1993. But before we get to the betrayal, you have to understand just how much trouble this company was really in. Because from the outside, the World Wrestling Federation in the summer of 1993 looked like a machine that would never break down. And on the inside, it was crumbling. By 1993, the boom period was over. The arenas that had been packed to the rafters during the Hulkamania explosion of the mid-1980s were getting quieter. The children who had bought every action figure and every foam figure were growing up. And worse than any of that, the entire industry was under a microscope like never before. The federal government had come knocking, and it was not going away. For years, whispers about performance enhancers in professional wrestling had been growing louder. Then, in 1991, a Pennsylvania doctor named George Zahorian, a man who had worked ringside at wrestling events, was convicted of illegally supplying banned muscle-building substances to wrestlers. The dominoes started to fall. Suddenly, the biggest names in the business were being named in newspapers and on television as users of those substances, and the biggest name of them all, the man whose enormous tanned 24-inch pythons had sold millions of tickets, was right in the center of the storm. Hulk Hogan had spent years telling children to say their prayers and eat their vitamins. And now the world was learning that the vitamins might not have been the only thing keeping those muscles inflated. It was a public relations nightmare. And the man at the very top of the company, the owner and promoter, was staring down the barrel of a federal investigation that could put him in prison and shut the entire operation down for good. So the company made a decision to change everything. If the era of the giant chemically enhanced superhero was dragging the whole promotion into a legal quagmire, then the era of the giant superhero had to end. It was time for something new. It was time for a new kind of star, smaller, more athletic, a wrestler who could carry the company on the strength of his in-ring ability rather than the size of his biceps. A wrestler who represented a clean break from the troubled past. And the man they chose for that role was the hitman, Bret Hart. Bret Hart was the son of the legendary Stu Hart, patriarch of the famous Hart wrestling family out of Calgary. He had spent years as one half of a beloved tag team before breaking out on his own. He was not a muscle-bound freak, he was a technician, a craftsman, a man who could go into the ring with almost anyone and drag a great match out of them through sheer skill and psychology. He was, by his own quiet estimation, and by the estimation of many of his peers, the best in-ring performer in the entire company. And in the fall of 1992, the company had put its top prize on him, crowning him World Wrestling Federation champion after a match with Ric Flair. This was the new direction, this was the new generation, and Bret Hart was going to be its flag bearer. There was just one problem. The new direction was not selling tickets fast enough. As the company built toward its biggest event of the year, WrestleMania IX, held in the spring of 1993 at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas, the numbers were troubling. Ticket sales were sluggish, the buzz was not there, and it moved the needle. The one man whose very presence still meant money no matter how much trouble he had brought with him. They brought back Hulk Hogan, and this is where the seeds of the entire betrayal were planted. Because Hogan did not come back to put anyone over, he did not come back to pass the torch to the young technician who was supposed to be leading the company forward. He came back, and almost immediately the plans for Bret Hart began to shift underneath his feet. At WrestleMania IX, Bret Hart defended his championship against the enormous Yokozuna, a 500-plus pound monster managed by the devious Mr. Fuji. The match was designed to end in controversy with Fuji, and the music hit. Hulk Hogan came storming down to the ring, ostensibly to check on his fallen friend and to protest the injustice of what had just happened. Mr. Fuji, drunk on his own arrogance, issued a challenge on the spot. He offered Hogan an immediate title match right then and there. Hogan accepted. Another handful of salt was thrown, another leg drop was delivered, and in a matter of seconds, the freshly crowned Yokozuna was flat on his back, and Hulk Hogan was the World Wrestling Federation champion for a record 5th time. The crowd in Las Vegas ate it up. The nostalgia was intoxicating. But backstage and in living rooms across the country where sharper fans were watching, something felt deeply wrong. The company had spent months building a new future, and in the span of a single evening at their biggest show, they had handed the entire thing back to the past. The torch had not been passed. It had been snatched away and planted right back in the hands of the man who was supposed to be leaving. The official plan, the one the company would later insist was always the plan, was that this was only temporary. Hogan would hold the belt for a short while, and then he would drop it and ride off into the sunset, clearing the way for the new stars once and for all. That was the story. That was what everyone was told. The question that would blow up into one of the most bitter disputes in wrestling history was simple. Who was Hulk Hogan supposed to drop that belt to? And depending on who you ask, the answer changes completely. Here's what Bret Hart says happened. And Bret has told this story many times over the years, in interviews, and most famously in his own autobiography. According to Bret, the plan coming out of WrestleMania was beautiful. It was the dream scenario. Hogan would beat Yokozuna and hold the title through the spring. Bret would enter the very first televised King of the Ring tournament and win it, proving in one single night that he could out-wrestle anyone the company could throw at him. He would become the King of the Ring. And then, at the summer's biggest event, in SummerSlam, the King of the Ring would challenge the champion. Bret Hart versus Hulk Hogan, the new guard against the old guard, the technician against the icon. Hogan would put Bret over cleanly in the middle of the ring, and in doing so, he would anoint Bret as the true leader of the company on his way out the door. It would have been one of the biggest matches the company could have possibly made, and Bret was told it was happening. He points to a specific piece of evidence at a television taping in Halifax, Nova Scotia in the late spring. Bret says he and Hogan took part in a photo shoot together. The two of them posed for the cameras in a mock tug of war, each man pulling on the championship belt from opposite sides. It was the kind of promotional image you only create when you are planning to build toward a match between two men. Bret took that photo shoot as confirmation. The wheels were in motion. Hulk Hogan versus Bret Hart was on the way. A longtime executive in the company, Bruce Pritchard, has since confirmed on his podcast that this was indeed the direction they were heading. The Halifax photo shoot was real. The intention, at least in the minds of the creative team at that moment, was absolutely to get to Hogan versus Bret at SummerSlam. That was the vision. Days after that photo shoot, Bret says he got a phone call from the boss himself, confirming everything. He would win the King of the Ring and he would win the championship back from Hogan at SummerSlam. Bret was over the moon. This was the validation of his entire career, the moment where the company would place its full faith in him against its biggest legend. And then, about 10 days later, the phone rang again. Bret says the boss warned him before he even said it that what he was about to hear was going to make him angry, and then he delivered the news. Hulk Hogan was flatly refusing to do the match. He would not put Bret over. He would not lose the title to him. And the reason that would light a fire in Bret Hart that never fully went out was that Hogan supposedly said Bret was not in his league, not on his level, not worthy of standing across the ring from him in that spot. So the plan was changed. The belt would go to Yokozuna instead. That was the version Bret Hart was told, and he believed it completely. He believed that Hulk Hogan, the man who had shaken his hand at WrestleMania and told him he was happy to return the favor someday, had looked down his nose at him and decided he was beneath him. But Hogan tells a very different story, and this is where the dark truth gets genuinely murky, because you have two men both convinced they are telling the truth, and a third man in the middle who may have lied to both of them. In Hogan's telling, laid out in his own autobiography years later, he never agreed to drop that belt to Bret Hart in the first place. According to Hogan, when he came back, he told the boss up front that he knew his time in the company was coming to an end. He proposed the whole WrestleMania scenario himself, the idea of swooping in to grab the title from Yokozuna, and his plan from the very beginning was simple. He would beat Yokozuna to win the belt, and then at the next pay-per-view, he would drop the belt right back to Yokozuna, and then he would be gone. Hogan insists losing the title back to the Giant was always the plan. In his version, there was never a promise to put over Bret Hart. There was never a SummerSlam torch passing in the works, at least not one he ever agreed to. He was simply doing what he had agreed to do, dropping the belt back to the monster he took it from. Now notice what is missing from Hogan's account. He never really addresses that Halifax photo shoot. He never explains why he was posing in a tug of war over the belt with Bret Hart if there was never any intention of the two of them working a program together. That silence is telling. And it is one of the reasons that so many people who have looked at this situation over the years have come to believe that the real villain of this story was not standing in either of these two men's shoes. The real villain, many believe, was the man holding the strings, the promoter, the owner, the man who told Bret Hart one thing and told Hulk Hogan another, and then stood back and watched the two of them turn on each other so that neither one of them would turn on him. Think about how it plays out. If the boss wanted the Hogan versus Yokozuna rematch because he believed a giant heel monster was worth more money at the box office than two good guys facing each other, then he had a problem. He had already sold Bret Hart on the dream of the SummerSlam main event. He had already had them pose for the photos. He needed a way to change course without taking the blame himself. So according to this reading of events, he simply told Bret that Hogan was the one who killed it. He made Hogan the bad guy. He let Bret believe that the reason his dream match was dead was because Hogan thought he was garbage. And Hogan, for his part, would later be furious about exactly this. He would say that it did not even matter to him whether Bret got the belt or not. What made him angry was that the boss had told him one thing and told Bret another, and in doing so, had made it look like the decision not to work with Bret was Hogan's call. It made Hogan look like he was not a team player. It painted a target on his back in the locker room, and he never forgave the boss for it. So you had two of the biggest stars in the industry, both furious, both feeling betrayed, and both aiming that fury at each other instead of at the man who actually deserved it. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and it set the stage for one of the most legendary backstage confrontations in the history of the business, a confrontation that took place on the very night of King of the Ring. But before we get to that explosion backstage, let us set the scene for what the fans actually saw. Because for all the poison behind the curtain, the show itself was on the surface a triumph. And at the center of that triumph was Bret Hart, wrestling the night of his life while carrying the weight of a betrayal that had just been dropped on his shoulders. The event took place on June 13th, 1993 at the Nutter Center in Dayton, Ohio. It was a landmark. For years, the King of the Ring tournament had been a house show event, something held in an arena for the live crowd, but never broadcast to the world. This was the first time the company had ever put the entire tournament on pay-per-view live for everyone to see. It was a bold experiment, and the crowd was, in a strange way, a symbol of the company's struggles. Only around 6,500 fans turned out that night, the lowest attendance any King of the Ring event would ever draw. The building was not full. The new generation was still fighting to find its audience. But the people who did buy the show at home turned out in force. The pay-per-view buy rate for that night would end up being the highest of any King of the Ring for the rest of the decade. The fans at home wanted to see who would be crowned. And what they got in the tournament matches was a genuine showcase of everything the company was trying to become. The whole point of the tournament, from a storytelling perspective, was to prove that Bret Hart was the best. And the way to prove it was to make him fight 3 times in one single night against 3 completely different kinds of opponents, and to have him overcome all of them through skill and heart. His first opponent was Razor Ramon, the slick, toothpick-flicking tough guy with the size and the swagger to bully almost anyone. Razor towered over Bret and used every bit of that size advantage, tossing him around and controlling long stretches of the match. But in the end, when Razor climbed to the top rope to finish it with a superplex, Bret shifted his weight at the perfect moment, came crashing down on top of him, and stole the pin. It was a small man's victory over a bigger man through timing and intelligence. Exactly the story the company wanted to tell. That should have been a hard enough night for anyone, but the bracket was cruel. Immediately after surviving Razor Ramon, Bret had to turn around and face one of the finest pure wrestlers who ever lived, Mr. Perfect. Curt Hennig, who wrestled as Mr. Perfect, was Bret Hart's equal in the ring in almost every way. He was a second-generation star, the son of a wrestling legend, and his ability to make everything look effortless had earned him his nickname. The two of them had a history, and when they locked up in that semifinal, they proceeded to tear the house down. It was a chess match. Counter after counter, reversal after reversal, two masters of their craft, trading holds and near falls while the crowd hung on every movement. They fought to the edge of the time limit, they spilled to the outside, and in the end, after nearly 20 minutes of grueling back and forth, Bret reversed a small package and scored the pin by the narrowest of margins. Many fans and critics consider that match one of the finest the company produced that entire year. Two matches, two of the toughest opponents imaginable, and Bret still was not done. Waiting for him in the final was Bam Bam Bigelow, the tattooed, flame-headed giant known as the Beast from the East. Bigelow was astonishingly agile for a man his size, capable of leaping to the top rope and flying through the air, and he was fresh, having received a bye into the final after a first-round tournament match on the show ended in a time-limit draw that eliminated 2 other men. So the story was set. An exhausted Bret Hart, having already fought twice, his body battered and his hand injured, against a fresh, massive monster who wanted to crush him. Bigelow dominated. He targeted Bret's back, throwing him into the ring post and the steel railings, softening him up for the kill. At one point, Bigelow's fearsome valet, the wild-eyed Luna Vachon, snuck down to ringside and cracked Bret across the back with a chair, allowing Bigelow to score a pinfall. But the officials caught the interference, restarted the match, and the war continued. Finally, after Bigelow charged into the corner and missed, Bret climbed up onto the giant's shoulders and flipped him forward, rolling him up in a victory roll for the 3 count. He had done it 3 matches in one night. Razor Ramon, Mr. Perfect, and Bam Bam Bigelow all conquered. Bret Hart was the king of the ring, and as he sat there exhausted and triumphant, he later wrote that for perhaps the first time in his entire career, he truly believed he was the best worker in the business, and that he would never take a backseat to another wrestler again. It should have been the happiest night of his professional life, but it was not, because in between those matches, in the private hidden world backstage, the betrayal was still eating at him, and at some point that night, Bret Hart came face to face with Hulk Hogan. The accounts of exactly what was said differ in their details, but the broad strokes are agreed upon by both men. Fueled by everything he had been told, convinced that Hogan had looked at him and declared him unworthy, Bret confronted the icon directly. He called him out for not wanting to work with him. He threw the insult back in his face, the claim that Bret was not in his league. And then, in the bluntest possible terms, Bret told Hulk Hogan to go to hell. He used considerably stronger language than that, but the meaning was unmistakable. It was one of the boldest things a mid-card star could ever do, telling the biggest name in the industry, a man with enormous backstage power, exactly where he could go. And here's the part that makes the whole thing so tragic. Hogan did not fire back with an insult. According to Bret, Hogan told him that he did not know the whole story. He hinted that there was more going on than Bret understood, that the situation was not what it appeared to be. Bret, still boiling, demanded to know the story, and Hogan told him he could not say. When Bret pressed him on why not, Hogan gave an answer that was almost sad in its pettiness. He said he could not tell Bret the whole story because Bret had just told him to go to hell. Bret's response was to tell him to go to hell again, and then he walked away, out toward the ring to wrestle the biggest match of his life while carrying all of that rage inside him. Think about what that exchange really reveals. Hogan knew that Bret had been lied to. Hogan knew that the boss had made him the villain of a story he had not written, and in that moment, he had a chance to clear the air, to tell Bret the truth, to unite the two of them against the real culprit. But his pride would not let him do it. Because Bret had disrespected him, he chose to let the younger man walk away, still believing a lie. Two men who should have been allies, both victims of the same manipulation, driven apart in a hallway because neither one could see past his own anger. That is the human cost of backstage politics. And it was only just beginning. Now we come to the main event, the match the whole controversy had been building toward, Hulk Hogan defending the championship against Yokozuna, and knowing everything we now know about what was happening behind the scenes watching this match becomes a genuinely strange experience. There were signs if you knew how to read them. For one thing, the championship match was not the final match of the evening. It was placed in the middle of the card, which for a company that always ended its shows with a title on the line was a quiet signal that something was off. And more importantly, throughout the match, Hulk Hogan did something Hulk Hogan almost never did. He spent the majority of the match on defense, getting beaten from pillar to post by the enormous Yokozuna, selling and struggling and looking for long stretches like a man who was not going to win. The match itself was slow and lumbering, two large men grinding against each other. Yokozuna controlled the early going. Hogan tried twice to body slam the Giant and could not get him off the ground. He absorbed a bear hug and a belly-to-belly suplex, and then, right on cue, came the moment the crowd had waited their whole lives to see. Hogan began to hulk up. He shook off Yokozuna's blows. He pointed at the Giant, he fired off his punches and connected with his big boot, but the Giant did not fall. Hogan hit a second big boot. Still, Yokozuna stood. It took a third boot to finally knock the monster off his feet, and then Hogan dropped the leg, his famous finisher, the move that had ended 1,000 matches and made him a legend, and Yokozuna kicked out. A hush fell over the arena. It was almost unheard of for anyone to survive the leg drop. The fans could sense that the ground was shifting beneath them, that the natural order they had trusted for a decade might be about to shatter. Hogan, seemingly frustrated, knocked Mr. Fuji off the ring apron. He called for the body slam that would finish it, and that is when it happened. A photographer, one of several who had been positioned at ringside, supposedly sent from Japan to cover the Giant's homecoming, leapt up onto the apron. He was disguised, wearing a fake beard and a wig. In reality, this was not a photographer at all. It was a devious manager from the roster named Harvey Whippleman, dressed in disguise as part of the conspiracy against Hogan. As Hogan turned toward him, the camera in the man's hands exploded. A fireball shot directly into Hulk Hogan's face, blinding him, leaving him staggering and helpless in the center of the ring. Yokozuna needed no second invitation. He knocked the blinded Hogan to the mat, dropped his own massive leg across him, and covered him for the 3 count. The Giant was champion again, and in a final symbolic act of destruction, Yokozuna hauled Hogan back up, propped him in the corner, climbed to the second rope, and crushed him with the enormous Banzai drop, driving his full weight down onto the fallen icon. The announcer at ringside cried out that Yokozuna had squashed Hulkamania. And the terrible thing was, he was right. As officials rushed down to help Hogan to the back, as children in the crowd were shown looking stunned and heartbroken, an entire era was ending in real time. Because that fireball and that leg drop marked the last time Hulk Hogan would wrestle a televised match for this company for 9 long years. He would work a handful of untelevised shows overseas that summer, mostly rematches against Yokozuna, and then he was gone. Off to the competition, off to a new life, leaving the company that had built him and that he had built, all in a cloud of resentment and broken promises. It is a strange thing to watch a legend get written off with a fake camera and a magic trick, but that was the deal. Hogan got to leave without cleanly losing to another wrestler, protecting his aura, blaming his defeat on a cowardly ambush rather than an honest defeat. And the company got him out the door. Everybody got something. Everybody except Bret Hart, who had been promised the honor of being the one to send the icon off, and who instead had to watch a fireball do the job that was supposed to be his. And the poison did not stop even after the match. Because according to Bret, at some point that night, he and Hogan actually ended up in the same room with the boss, together, trying to get to the bottom of what had really happened. And what unfolded in that meeting is perhaps the most revealing moment in this entire dark saga. In Bret's account, Hogan stood there and repeated what he had apparently believed, that Bret was supposed to get the title back at SummerSlam, but that when the boss told him it would not be a title match, Hogan had backed out. And Bret, hearing this, turned to the boss for confirmation, and the boss, the man who had spun this entire web, looked at both of his biggest stars and calmly denied everything. He claimed he had never ever said it would be a title match. In Hogan's version of that same meeting, Bret asked the boss to confirm that he had told Bret that Hogan refused to drop him the belt. And the boss simply told Bret that no, that was just what Bret thought he heard. Just what you thought you heard. Sit with that for a moment. Two of the most powerful, most famous performers in the entire industry standing in a room, both of them absolutely certain they had been told specific things, and the man in charge simply looking them in the eyes and telling them their own memories were wrong, denying it all, refusing to take an ounce of responsibility. Bret wrote that in that moment he finally understood the truth. He was a pawn, a piece being moved around a board in a game between the boss and Hogan, a game in which his own dreams and his own dignity were nothing more than bargaining chips, and Hogan, according to Bret, actually left that meeting with tears in his eyes. Picture it. Hulk Hogan, the invincible superhero, the biggest star the business had ever produced, walking out of a backstage meeting on the verge of tears because the man he had helped make rich had just hung him out to dry in front of a rival. That is the reality behind the muscles and the bandana and the tearing of the shirt. That is the dark truth. These were human beings being manipulated and discarded by a system that saw them as commodities. And there is one more piece to the on-screen story that night, one final act that would have enormous consequences. After Bret won his 3 matches and was crowned King of the Ring, a coronation ceremony was held in the ring. A throne, a robe, a crown, and a scepter. Bret sat there, the conquering hero, being celebrated at last. And then Jerry Lawler came out. Lawler, a legend from the Memphis territory who had called himself the King for decades, strode down to the ring and declared that there was only room for one king in this company, and it was not Bret Hart. He mocked Bret, belittled his family, and then attacked him, beating him with the very scepter and throne that had been part of the celebration. As the broadcast went off the air, the newly crowned king was lying on the floor, battered, unable to fight back. It was the beginning of a feud between Bret Hart and Jerry Lawler that would rage on for more than 2 years and become one of the most personal, most heated rivalries the company ever produced. So that was the night. A young star wrestling his heart out 3 times over, a legend written off in a puff of smoke, a promise broken, a lie told, and a manipulator escaping accountability yet again. On the surface, a coronation. Underneath, a graveyard of trust. But we are not done, because there is a deeper layer of darkness to King of the Ring 1993, one that has nothing to do with backstage politics or broken promises. It is the darkness of what came after, the terrible toll that this business and the era it belonged to took on the men who gave their bodies and their lives to it. Let us go back to the fireball for a moment and the storm it was born from. Remember, the entire reason the company was scrambling in 1993, the entire reason they had panicked and brought Hogan back and then written him off, was the scandal over performance enhancers. And that scandal was not going away. Just 5 months after King of the Ring, in November of 1993, the owner of the company was indicted by the federal government. The charges related to the supply of banned muscle-building substances to his wrestlers. The man who had spent that summer manipulating Hogan and Bret was now facing the possibility of federal prison. The trial took place the following summer in 1994. It was a genuine threat to the survival of the entire company. Some of the biggest names in the business were dragged into the proceedings. Hulk Hogan himself testified, an experience that only deepened the bad blood appearing in court to discuss the very substances that had built the physiques that sold all those tickets. In the end, after a trial full of legal missteps and underwhelming testimony, the owner was acquitted on the charges. He walked free, the company survived. But the whole ordeal was a stark reminder of the culture that had taken root in that industry, a culture of chemical enhancement and physical extremes that would cast a long, dark shadow over everyone in it. And that shadow is where the true tragedy of King of the Ring 1993 lives. Because when you go back and look at the men who filled that card, who fought in that tournament and stood in that ring, the list of those who died young is genuinely staggering. This was not just a wrestling show. In hindsight, it was a gathering of men, so many of them destined for early graves. Start with the giant himself. Yokozuna, the man who ended Hulkamania that night, who stood tall as champion while a legend was carried out on his back. His real name was Rodney Anoa'i, a member of the legendary Samoan wrestling dynasty that would go on to produce some of the biggest stars in the world. In the ring, his size was his gift, the thing that made him a main event monster. Out of the ring, it was killing him. His weight ballooned to well over 500 pounds and by some accounts approached 600. In October of 2000, just 7 years after his triumph in Dayton, Yokozuna died in a hotel room in Liverpool, England, while on a tour overseas. He was 34 years old. The cause was fluid in his lungs, a consequence heavily tied to his enormous size. He was younger when he died than many people are when they buy their first house. A two-time world champion, a Royal Rumble winner, gone at 34. Then there is the man who fought Bret Hart in that unforgettable semifinal, the wrestler many consider one of the greatest pure technicians the sport ever saw. Mr. Perfect, Curt Hennig. That match with Bret was a display of everything that was beautiful about professional wrestling. Two artists at the peak of their powers. Curt Hennig died in February of 2003 in a hotel room in Florida. The cause was a drug overdose. He was 44 years old. And what about the final opponent? The giant Bret conquered to win his crown. Bam Bam Bigelow, the beast from the East, the tattooed monster with the astonishing agility. His life after wrestling was marked by struggles with drug abuse, but it was also marked by an act of extraordinary heroism. In the year 2000, Bigelow ran into a burning building and pulled 3 children out of the flames, suffering second-degree burns across nearly half his body in the process. A real-life hero. And yet the demons that chased so many men of his era caught up with him too. Bam Bam Bigelow died in January of 2007. He was 45 years old, and the pattern does not stop there. Look at the Intercontinental Championship match from that night where Shawn Michaels defended his title against the powerful Hawaiian Crush. Crush, whose real name was Bryan Adams, was a massive, imposing figure who had started his career as one half of the face-painted tag team Demolition. Bryan Adams died in 2007 in his early 40s, another name added to the grim list, another life from that card that ended far too soon. And then, perhaps most heartbreaking of all, there is the man who wrestled in the dark match before the pay-per-view even began. Before the cameras went live that night, Bret Hart's own younger brother, Owen Hart, wrestled a match against Papa Shango. Owen was one of the most gifted athletes in the entire company, a man whose in-ring ability may have even surpassed his famous older brothers, and a beloved locker room presence known for his pranks and his kindness. 6 years after quietly opening that show in Dayton, Owen Hart died in the most public and horrifying way imaginable, falling to his death from the rafters of an arena during a botched entrance stunt at a pay-per-view event in 1999. He was 34 years old. His death remains one of the darkest days the industry has ever known, and it tore the Hart family apart in ways that never fully healed. Yokozuna, Mr. Perfect, Bam Bam Bigelow, Crush, Owen Hart, 5 men who were all in that building that night, all of them alive and healthy and chasing their dreams, and all of them gone before their time. And that is not even a complete list. It is simply a sampling of the human cost hidden inside a single evening's entertainment. When you watch King of the Ring 1993 today, you are watching a roster of ghosts. You are watching men in the prime of their lives, unaware of the clock ticking down on so many of them, giving everything they had for a business that would grind so many of them into dust. That is the real dark truth. It is not just that a promise was broken. It is not just that 2 great stars were played against each other by a manipulative boss. It is that the entire era, the whole culture of extreme size and chemical enhancement and a brutal, unrelenting schedule with no health protections and no safety net was quietly killing the very men who made it magical. The fireball that ended Hulkamania was a special effect, but the fire that consumed so many of the performers on that card was terribly, tragically real. And this is what makes King of the Ring 1993 such a fascinating and haunting piece of history. It sits at a crossroads. It was the end of one era, the era of the larger-than-life superhero, symbolized by Hogan's fiery exit, and it was the beginning of another, the new generation, the era of the smaller, more athletic star, symbolized by Bret Hart's coronation. It captured a company in transition, desperately trying to save itself from a legal reckoning while its biggest names schemed and manipulated and betrayed one another behind the scenes, and it gave us three of the finest tournament matches ever assembled on a single night, a genuine showcase of the art form at its best. And it gave us a backstage story so bitter and so human that the two men at its center were still arguing about it decades later, each writing their own version of events in their own books, each convinced the other had wronged him, when in truth they had both been wronged by the same man. Bret Hart would go on to become the champion the company needed him to be, carrying the promotion through some of its hardest years. His relationship with Hulk Hogan never recovered. To this day, the two of them tell conflicting stories about what happened that summer, and the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, buried under 30 years of ego and pain and selective memory. But one thing is certain: the seeds of their lifelong animosity were planted in the hallways of the Nutter Center on the night of June 13th, 1993. A coronation built on a betrayal, a legend written off in a puff of smoke to cover the retreat of a broken promise, a boss lying to two of his biggest stars at once and walking away untouched. And beneath it all, an entire generation of performers giving their bodies, and for so many, ultimately their lives, to a business that celebrated them in the ring and forgot them once the cameras stopped rolling. The show goes on, the tournaments continue, new kings are crowned every year, but if you ever go back and watch that first televised King of the Ring, watch it with clear eyes, watch the fireball, and know what it was really covering up. Watch Bret Hart lift that scepter and know what he had just been robbed of, and watch all those faces in that arena, so full of life, and remember them. Because that is the real story, not the one they showed you on the broadcast, the one that happened in the shadows, in the hallways, and in the years that followed.